Well, I mean, I just never understood the Catholic Church, not, with all the problems they're having, with all the problems they're having.
Last night, the guy, right?
Yeah, exactly. With all the stuff that's going on in the Catholic Church, I can't, and I understand maybe not 20 years ago, but how about in the last 10 years?
Yes, exactly.
And to not allow women, now I can see if you don't want to have married people because of family or whatever, that's fine, but to not allow women in the Catholic Church to do something other than just be
pretty.
well, they did take off the headscarf requirement, although some people still do that.
I was here when Father Joe finally buckled and said, okay, when some of the women in the parish approached him just to be readers or serve communion.
Oh.
Just to be a reader even.
Yeah.
I
Did you
think,
finally go along with that, readers?
Finally, but he had a
What
lot
about
of,
communion?
eventually, yes.
Oh,
But
yes.
only that, and I'll be honest with you, the only reason why he went ahead and consented to that was because they needed people to be able to take communion to those that were homebound.
Yeah.
Oh,
So they needed more
yes.
people.
Yeah. No, I had never seen in the 30 plus years I was going to Catholic Church, never saw
Yeah.
a woman touch the elements, let alone serve them.
I think the basis for it is pretty feeble. If this is all, if what he offers in here is the fact that Christ picked only men to be apostles, if that's the basis for it, that's pretty thin.
Well,
I'm surprised he got that many people left in the Catholic Church.
yeah.
I'd bail out of that in a second. Put up with that crap.
I'm gonna close the door and start, and people can come in, including Pat, because otherwise we won't.
Both paths.
Okay, so let's do an opening prayer. Thank to my little cheat sheet here. Eternal God, we trust in the assurance that wherever 2 or 3 are gathered together, there your Spirit will be present. We give thanks to the community of faith, where we can gather together with others to wrestle with whatever concerns are laid out in our hearts. Guide us today as we continue this study, and keep us open to fresh understandings and insights that can lead to continued growth. In the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Okay. It was a short chapter, but it was quite illuminating to me. Any overall take that somebody wants to start with? And otherwise, we'll go through the section by section. But is there any sort of bottom line or thing that hits you?
Not only did, I forgot my book, I actually highlighted, underlined, and put stickums in there now. Nothing.
Okay.
But
that's fine.
it was, I found it very interesting, and I liked the conclusion he came up with. But you guys are gonna have to remind me what it was.
I think it's pretty obvious why it started that way, like you said, all the apostles, all the disciples that he named were all male, and it's easy to understand why it began that way, but then like Bruce said, it was a pretty feeble rock to stand on for very long, and why didn't someone speak up sooner?
Yeah, it was.
But think about women's place throughout history.
Right.
Women have had to fight for any equal rights.
Mm-hmm.
They've had, and still do in a lot of cases. Women had to. Women couldn't own property for many years. I mean, many centuries they couldn't own property, even if they inherited it. If they inherited it, they weren't allowed to sign for it or do anything legal with it. And whether it was male dominance or what, I don't know. I would say there's a lot of that. The males just didn't want to allow females to have a role because maybe they were afraid.
Well, it had its roots in Judaism. Judaism, there was no place for the women in that whole religion. Still I have problems with
Right.
it.
Well, there's still a lot of our cultural, groups that are still very patriarchal. I mean, what country, was it Egypt that just allowed their women to get a driver's license?
Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
so, I mean, this is
Yeah.
2018, so,
Yes.
They still have to have permission to go out of the country.
exactly.
Well, they have to have permission to get their driver's license. I think they have, did they have to have permission? Or not now, but they did before. I don't know.
From a man in
They
the
have to
house
get
to
permission.
let them
But
go.
they're-
Exactly,
Right.
yes, exactly.
There are so few societies or cultural groups that are truly matriarchal, you know, and there aren't.
Yeah. Well, I
It
know.
takes science fiction, the Amazon women kind of thing.
Wonder Woman.
Wonder Woman and the Amazons to be able to get a woman's culture that was run by women.
I mean, I remember when I was growing up, I mean, the Hispanic is very, in some families, very matriarchal, because I can remember as a kid, you know, go ask grandma, not go ask grandpa, you know, when it
Right.
came to, you know, decisions or, you know,
Were
wanting.
those more household decisions and family decisions
No,
as
they were
opposed to?
they were familia decisions, you
Okay,
know.
all right. I was just trying to think whether.
And it
but
wasn't
I know that
even-
was in my house. That was, my mother certainly was the strong one, don't you agree?
Oh, yeah, she definitely was, but I know
And
from.
my mother was as well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But,
my mother wasn't. She was
No,
always go ask
no.
your father.
Well, but your father was still active duty at
Yes.
the time, so.
That had a lot to do with it, I'm
Yeah.
sure.
Whereas my father was retired at the time, so. We were talking early, before we even got officially started, about the Catholic Church that Pope John Paul II on May 22nd of 1994,
Right.
so what, almost 25 years ago, 24 years ago, put out a letter to the bishops in the Catholic Church saying we aren't going to change, basically. And his approach was, which we just mentioned, was that the Christ chose men, and therefore, for some reason, he excluded men, and therefore we're going to exclude women, or excluded women. He's going to exclude women from the ministry. But when you think about it, two things. One was what was life like, and what was Judaism like back in 2,000 years ago.
Right.
If he had chosen women, would have they been listened to? You know, if he had actually picked 6 and 6 or something, would they have been able to have any authority? Would they have been able to do anything? And the answer is probably not, just due to the cultural situation at the time, let alone the religious.
If you also think about it, especially back then under Judaism, and it's still going on now, the women aren't free to wander all over the country and be disciples. I mean, they got to stay home and take care of the kids and do all the rest of it. The guys are free to go ahead and bolt out and do all that stuff. So women never really had a chance because they still got a baby in their arms.
Yeah.
And so the guys jumped on that real quick.
Well, I know when I was flying, we had a group of, I always had the route from New York, and we had a set of Jews on the aircraft, and the women definitely had no say. They took care of the children, and that's it.
Yeah.
They had no say whatsoever.
Yeah.
I think
Even
even,
snacks.
Sue can speak to this as well, that we had the opportunity to go to Turkey in 2015. And I can still remember catching myself watching the dynamics of a group of people or a group of family, and very boldly the men were out front, you know, and the women and the children were like little, yeah, like little sheep following, you know, and that was,
That's it.
you know, 3 years ago.
Not that far away from the cave.
No, not at all. You still see that with animals.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Interesting.
Especially
Yes.
the slime and the
I hadn't thought
Except the quail. Father quail runs around and gathers them up in the back.
Yeah, it does. They're so
Because the
cute.
road runners will get them if he
Oh, I
doesn't protect
know.
them.
So there's a point here made by Adam after that part about the Catholic Church, which we were just discussing. Did he really have in his mind that men were the only people that could be disciples, or was he really choosing his apostles based on who might have the greatest likelihood of receiving a hearing and becoming accepted leaders in first century Judaism? And it's the latter, which Adam argues is the reason. And then there's this, which I'd never heard before, but I read this, but of course I don't do a lot with Jewish people. A morning blessing within Judaism. Do you remember what that was?
I don't know.
Blessed, O God, King of the universe, who has not made me a woman. And all the men would say that every morning
Yes.
as part of their daily prayers.
Huh.
That was page
260.
250,
It was men or
256.
to be women.
256. Oh, I see, the sequence goes.
So,
They just didn't want to have to.
Oh, thank you. I do remember reading that too.
so what's your reaction to that? Anybody want to?
Don't men still do that?
Well, yeah. To be honest, I think men just say, yeah, that's probably okay. Although I think that nowadays, I think there's a lot more perspectives. Men are allowed to, show emotion more than they used to be. You used to when you were supposed to be very stoic and no, not emotional. I've always been emotional.
And it added words to the dictionary, like androgynous and, those kind of
Mhm.
things.
They have like home dads now, that
Right.
That's
and
right.
mom goes out and works.
Even in the commercials,
Yes.
dad's doing the
Yes.
laundry and
Well,
taking the kids shopping.
Mr. Mom, wasn't that a movie?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing is the guys didn't have a lot of choice either. That was, you had to be a man. You had to step out there and get in your fair share of fights and carry spears and do all that's what you were raised to do. And if you didn't have the guts to do it, they found out real quick about that. So there was a lot of pressure on the guys too to be bold, macho, and all that kind of stuff. And if you were, well, I can remember growing up. I mean, in the schoolyards. I mean, you were constantly being tested,
Oh, yeah.
and it never stops.
You
And,
still see that with
yeah, you
fraternities.
still go on now. So the guys aren't as free as we may take a shortcut and think about it. They have to play this role. I mean, just that very prayer
Right.
sticks them in a corner. You gotta grab your spear and let's go.
Yeah.
It's interesting when I think about it because I'm thinking about, being a mother and thinking about mother animals, how ferocious we could be in protecting our families
yes.
and everything, which
Especially kids.
even maybe more than men, it's just so maternal
Yeah.
to protect.
Mhm.
Yeah, hurt me, but don't hurt my kid.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Don't dare hurt my kid.
Yeah.
So it's interesting with that in mind that it was ever allowed for men to just take over and be in charge.
Well, I think partly most men want to do that to show whatever reason, their machoism, their superiority, or in their minds, or whatever.
Power.
It's just not true. I mean, if we realize it, a strong partner makes a big difference.
A team.
And a team is much stronger than a single. But when you get in a situation where you're trying to dominate, then you lose that teamwork.
Well, don't you think you get a lot of that too from your places of employment, your jobs, the types of jobs? Because, the other side to that is, thank God I wasn't born a man, because I mean, in my particular situation, I did have some of the pressures of providing for my family because I was a single mom, But early on, you know, I kept thinking about all the pressures that my dad or my grandfather and my uncles had to provide for their family, you
Go
know,
to
the
war.
type of work, go to war, you know, all of those things, so, you know.
Yeah. The change of paradigm with the women's movement, if you will, now is we have more and more female soldiers who are ending up in the VA and ending up in the hospitals and stuff than we used to ever have. We still had some of that because of nurses and others who were in special duty, but generally it was the men who were taking the brunt of it. Even though I don't know exactly what the statistics are, but about 50-50 men and women as far as birth rates and stuff.
There's a gal from Boulder City that was in the Navy, Eleanor Dean, that, I mean, she was career Navy. She went in like right after high school, many, many years in the Navy, and it was only until right before she was getting ready to retire that she got to the point where she could command a ship. But she had to really, really work and prove herself and to even get to that point.
Oh, and women pilots.
Pilots, yeah.
Yeah.
Pilots. Women in World War II did a lot of the ferry jobs, ferrying
They
the
did.
new planes
They
to
did,
battle.
yep.
Then they had to go back and ferry another plane instead of actually participating in any battles. But now, and I don't know, I mean, when I was in the Navy, it was still the waves. So I've not been in the Navy since the change around where you don't have the waves anymore, and you just have officers. But I know we had 2 female officers in my office, but they were both waves, and they were both administrative personnel and admin and stuff. They weren't given any other kind of technical jobs. Of course, in engineering school, we had, I think in my 5 years of engineering school, I think we may have had that many women total. But, you know, if that. And it was a small school, but even so. The next problem we've got after Jesus choosing men is Paul. And if you read Paul's letters, many times he's saying women should be seen but not heard. Don't talk. If you want to know something, if you want to ask a question, wait till you get home and ask your husband. And the question is, was this because Paul believed that's what God inspired and what Jesus taught? Or was it because that was, again, the social norm of the time 2,000 years ago?
Well, Paul was a Jew,
Paul was a Jew.
and that's the way the Jews ran that show. So even though he finally had the scales taken off his eyes, he was still a Jew.
Yeah.
He still had this behavior.
Yeah. So there's 3 or 4 examples of Bible passages from Paul's letters. And some of it goes back to Adam and Eve, and basically part of what seems to be coming through from Paul and from others was it's because it was all Eve's fault. Because the world fell apart because of Eve, and the original sin, therefore it's women have to be subservient, and they're cursed because of that.
But then you could look at the other side of the story and say, what happened to Adam's power? What happened to his sense of power to be able to, you know, push her aside and say, nope, not the right thing to do.
Exactly. So he obviously wasn't a stand-up guy either.
Or his mind was on other things
Or
besides an
like,
apple.
yeah, he was paying more attention about fig
No, maybe
leaves or-
Eve was
fig
going,
leaves or no fig leaves or
apple
something.
or me, apple or me, you know, who knows?
Well, maybe if he had somebody else to choose from, he might have been able to say, I'm sorry, you're trying to have me go down the wrong path. I'm going to go over here and find Eva. But he didn't have that choice. But if you remember from first beginning lessons of this section with the early creation story. There was two different creation stories, and then there was two different Adam and Eve stories. The first one said, and God created man and woman, male and female, and all the animals. And then the second part of it was, he created Adam, and then Eve came out of Adam. Took a rib and created woman from man. That's the name woman came from. So, again, we have conflicting parts of the Bible. And as you go through, if you look at Jesus' ministry, I mean, look at how prominent the women were and how he treated the women.
Yeah.
He treated them as equals. Even though he didn't have women disciples, he had as close to disciples as you could get with his mother, Mary Magdalene,
Right.
with the other Mary, and who found
Mary's did.
who found the risen Christ? Okay, who was the first Mary? That was a Mary Magdalene, or in one case it was 2 or 3 of them, but depending on which gospel you want to quote.
So then how did that, again, having never studied the Bible, how then does that justify the writers of these Gospels not acknowledging that or not taking off on that and giving more merit to women?
They were Jews.
Okay.
They were Jews.
Still
and
the
they-
same
They were
thing.
Jews with the same.
And all the
mindset.
scribes were men.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So another question that I had when I was reading this, and again, because I have not studied the Bible, is there anywhere in the Bible that I mean, you see the church, or you see his church, is there anywhere in the Bible where the church is described as her church?
Was it her church? I don't know.
I do not think so.
I can't remember anything.
But you know, I've been sitting here thinking about where and when did this begin? And could this have begun with the Jewish religion and culture and everything? Because I'm thinking to myself, I know that Egyptians had female gods, and they had female rulers and even female pharaohs. And the Greeks and the Romans had female gods, but the I don't want to say Israelites, Jewish religion, from the beginning, women were lesser than men. And where did that come from?
It come from whoever wrote Genesis.
That's what I was thinking. And I'm sitting here thinking about the Chinese and the Hindus and other
Well, the big thing,
Mongolian.
back when Judaism began, one of the things that got it started was a single God. None of these Greek
Right,
multiple
right,
gods.
right.
There's one, and it's a he.
And flip a
And
coin,
that's where it
it's gonna be
started, in Ur.
yes.
And so I can't think of the word. What's the word for God is male and one. There's only one God that overall creation, and that's how they got. I can't think of it.
Omnipotent?
There's a word that the Jews coined, and it was
Which y'all.
not that far away from
What does
from
that
I
mean?
am. Yeah, it was. I don't know. It'll come to me tomorrow night.
Will you call us? Yeah.
Write it down
Because
and
I'm
bring it
sure
to
we
class
won't be able to
next week.
sleep until you do.
Write it down and bring it to class next week.
That's why we text. You know, you gotta let us know at midnight. We'll all be up.
So Adam points out that in Genesis 3, we were talking about Genesis 2, where how he provided the story, but in Genesis 3, Adam's point is that none of this is a reporter's account. Nobody had the videos, nobody had the tape recorders, nobody was taking notes. Only 2 of them. Who was going to take the notes? So this is what happened, whatever it was, thousands of years later, if in fact you believe that Adam and Eve were real as opposed to archetypical. So the point was that wasn't necessarily what actually happened. It was somebody's interpretation as they start to write these scriptures of what they thought sounded like a good story. And again, people were writing over men.
Yep. Right.
And so they weren't going to write, well, the women had a predominant role. It was all women's fault. So that's how these things get started. And then people believe it. And you still have people who today believe that you got to read the Bible as it's written, word for word, even with all the contradictions and stuff. We've had those discussions. Adam's done a great job trying to explain why that's not the case.
Right.
Eve, because of her poor judgment, he wasn't a very good partner, was he? Because he was partly to blame too.
Yes.
But the only thing it says here is Eve's poor judgment.
Well, he went along with it, so that's a judgment.
Yeah.
Maybe
That's
the
judgment
writer-
in itself.
Yep.
Maybe the writer was saying, well, I'll find a way to control my wife and teenage daughter. I'll make a Bible. I'll make it a law.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting, Adam's comment about his youngest daughter, 8 years old, reading the Bible, third grade Bible,
Yeah.
and says, what's all these stories about? Where are the women? Where are their names?
Yeah.
And he says, well, maybe we shouldn't be reading the Old Testament. Let's start in the New Testament. Well, that's not much better. I did read, and I don't know what everybody else did, I went and read Judges 19 to 21. Did anybody else go
No.
back and read that reference that was in here on page 259? I really don't want to read this.
About
So
the
I
guy
won't.
who gives up his daughter to
Yeah.
save his friend?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And about a bunch of other things that were done to women. So if you want to read how life was really, and I would say my guess is pretty accurate about life back then, and you want to get shocked, basically, read Judges 19 to 21. You don't even have to read the whole thing. You only have to read a couple sections of it. It's just amazing to me.
Men would go to prison for that kind of behavior,
Yes. Well, men and women go to prison for lots of things. There was just an article in the paper about how the police, detectives and stuff, when they're looking into a murder, the very first thing they do, if a woman's been killed, they'll look to the male partner, because that's 40% or something of women who are killed by a male partner. Whereas they said men who are killed, much a lower percentage are killed by the female partner. That's probably because men get killed by too many other things. They're out doing other things. But there was an article in today's paper that an estranged husband broke in at 2 a.m. to the ex's house, and she killed him. And she, as of now, she's not been charged. The detective said, we'll turn it over to the DA to decide, but we're not going to charge her. So,
Must have been in Florida.
no, I think it was here in town.
Boulder
Oh, was
City?
it?
Not in Boulder City, but in Vegas. I mean,
Boulder City, yeah, wow.
did anybody see, to diverge for a second, did anybody see the article in the paper that had the diagrams of all the different serious crime in the Vegas Valley? They had dots for different kinds of crimes, and you looked at Henderson, and there was some, and then you get down towards the center part of Las Vegas, particularly the south side of the 515 area, and just this side of the strip and stuff. It's almost all dots.
Really?
And it's just, and this was I think this was 2017 statistics that they were showing.
Which paper?
The RJ.
The RJ,
Yeah.
okay.
So, I think that, the whole thing about how things have changed, it's becoming more equal opportunity, but then now we're having more women doing things that was probably unheard of or never was talked about years ago.
Well, the book, this even alludes to like the reading in Judges where he gives up his daughter. You know, that still goes on with the sex trafficking and stuff.
Oh, right.
It does. It's
Yeah.
still going
And,
on.
and in a lot of other societies, women still have to be, there's still arranged marriages, women still have no say in who they get to marry.
And usually, in some of them, it's even young girls
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
that
like
are
14 years
12 or
old.
12, 13 years old.
Yeah.
You know.
Oh, here was the statistics, actually, it wasn't an RJ, it was in here, right in here on page 260. What I was just talking about, women are murdered 40% of the time, it's the perpetrator's a husband or boyfriend, less than 7% of the men that are murdered by a girlfriend. But this was, I just saw this in the paper as well, talking about the same thing.
About 100% of those men will say she drove me to it. Like
Well, and 90% were probably right.
Yesterday I drove down Buchanan all the way down to, what is it, an electrical station or something there? I'd never been there before.
Substation, yeah.
I'm just kind of driving around, looking around. There's a big sign that said something like, no shooting for the next 1,000 feet or something. I go, am I the only one in Boulder City that doesn't have a gun? I mean, am I in the middle of a shooting range here?
Yeah, you were. The new gun range is down there now because of the freeway.
Yeah, they moved it.
You'll never go there again, will you?
Oh, they did, huh? So
No,
where is
no, my
it?
armored truck.
It's on the other side of the new freeway. Once it opens, you'll go under the freeway
Under-
to get to the new range.
Oh, didn't know that.
Mhm.
Interesting.
But you gotta know how far 1,000 feet is.
That's true.
Got your tape.
So just to summarize, on page 260, we talked a little bit about Mary Magdalene and being the first one to see the resurrected Christ, but she doesn't recognize him, she thinks he's the gardener. But the point that Adam's bringing out is that Jesus came to reverse the curse of Eden. And part of that curse is the subordination of women. So that's
Yes.
Adam's take on that.
That's what I remember, and that's what I
Yeah,
highlighted.
mine's underlined as well.
Yeah, yeah, that was a very good conclusion, I like that.
So, sin brought patriarchy, but shouldn't the ideal of redemption be a return to partnership and end to subordination of women?
It's too bad it took 2,000 years
Yeah.
for everybody to get that message.
Well, I guess I'm glad to see that women still have gotten the vote.
You are.
Our founding fathers, you didn't say our founding fathers and mothers, it's our founding fathers. And, the country came out of that back in the 1700s too. So, I mean, it's just the
Well,
way,
that's what I was thinking.
it was the way that either men subordinated women, or it's just the way the cultures of the times. And it did take a big fight to get people to,
I
wake
don't know
up
about
and-
your neighborhood, but where I grew up, we didn't have female mayors or senators or governors, and all the women in the neighborhood stayed home, the men worked.
right.
The teachers are all women. This is liberating men. Now the men can teach elementary school.
Or
Yeah,
nurses.
Or
Yes,
nurses,
that's true.
yes, male nurses are a lot more prevalent than they used to be, and female doctors. And so it's one of those things like, you gotta be really careful what you say. When you see a woman in scrubs, you don't call her a nurse. If you wanna err on the other side.
You can call me ma'am. It's interesting to see a male nurse taking care of a wounded female veteran,
Mhm.
interesting.
Yeah.
Times have changed,
Yeah, they have.
and,
Which is good.
So the bottom line here is, isn't it time to recognize that Paul's words remain silent, don't reflect God's timeless will for the role of women? Perfect timing. We were just talking about you.
yeah.
Maybe I should leave again.
It's interesting, the females outnumber the men in this room. And
I
women.
know.
Yeah, and thanks for holding down the fort last week.
That was
Before.
good.
I don't know if it was held down.
Circle the wagons.
Yeah, it was pretty rough.
So next week is another short discussion. Is it okay to get a tattoo? But I think what we want to talk about next week is also other examples of our learning to read the Bible. So think about it.
I have a request.
Yes, sure.
Next week is supposed to be the tattoo,
Right.
and then the following week is about homosexuality. I don't know if you guys know this, but Connie and I are gay.
What do
She's
you
going to
read?
be out of town that week.
Oh.
Can we switch
Of course.
so that we're here
Oh,
to
no,
discuss
we
that?
can't do that.
Well, you're not even here
No
anyway.
flexibility.
Well, actually, I was
What are you
kinda
talking about, the
thinking- I was
tattoo?
kinda
What-
thinking
what are you
that
looking
chapter 29 was something we probably wouldn't take 2 weeks on. So why don't we do this? Why don't we cover, is it okay to get a tattoo for about 10 minutes? Because that's about all the time we need.
And whatever you want to do,
and then
maybe
move on
just, she
into
wanted to
chapter
be
29.
here.
Yeah, I'm gonna be gone pretty
She's
much
gonna
the
be
rest of the
gone
month.
for the rest of the
Right.
month, so she kinda
We
wanted to
definitely-
be here to put her 2
Is that
cents.
okay if we just, yeah, we
Whatever you need to do.
We covered it?
Yeah,
Or not, we just start on 20, we can start on 29, I don't have a problem with that.
Well, when will you'll be gone the month of August, right?
I'll be leaving the 10th and won't be
Oh,
home
okay.
until later on in the month.
And Bruce and I are the same.
We'll be
Oh,
going.
yeah.
All right, so let's go ahead and start, we'll start right on 29 next time.
Okay.
Before
And-
next Sunday, make sure you read the article that was, I can't remember where I read it, but you can now, if your loved one has a tattoo, maybe some of you saw this article.
We're not gonna do that.
That's okay, but you can now save it. That's the new thing for the undertakers. They can take that skin off of your loved one, preserve the skin in such a way that it becomes
Frame it.
in a form that you can frame it and
Of course you
and
can.
save it as a memoir of your loved
I
one.
don't think so.
That's what you're gonna do with Mickey. With the big bulldog. Her daughter has a tattoo of a bulldog
But you
on
can
her back.
always have a memory of your loved one by asking the mortician to take the
I
tattoo
guess a photograph just
and
won't
preserve
do
the
it.
skin. Food for thought to start next Sunday.
Wow.
We just were watching a documentary last night on Roger Stone, and it showed him, he's got a big picture of Richard Nixon on his wall.
Yeah, big tattoo, big, right on his back, I didn't know that.
Oh,
Couldn't figure that one out. Boy, I tell you, rough.
oh.
Should we close with a brief prayer? Dear Lord, we thank you for this time together to share our understanding of your Bible and the messages you have for us. And thank you for helping us keep an open mind in our discussions and learning more about each other as well as our faith and your words for us. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, now you're just